Europe, 1941. The dawn of what's to be considered one of the most tragic events in our world's history, the Holocaust. The Holocaust is thus defined in historical terms as the period of time of which European Jews were gathered and mass executed during World War II. Ever since I was a child, the Holocaust intrigued me, and I had always yearned to learn more. I would bury my face in multiple books in an attempt to learn more. The Holocaust is something that no one can change. It is a fact that's happened in the past, and it's tragic nonetheless. But we can learn about it. The Jewish people were considered inferior to the ideal race, which thus inspired the Holocaust, leaving the Jewish people decimated and broken at the conclusion of the Holocaust. What really inspired the Holocaust, though? One of the main reasons as to the occurrence of the Holocaust had to do with the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in June of 1919. The Treaty of Versailles, which is thus signed by the Allied nations at the conclusion of the First World War, claimed that Germany was forced to pay back all the war damages to the First World War, which was around 6,600 pounds, which equates to $849 billion in our current currency. This decimated the German economy. According to Elle Marie, a German occupant during the Great Depression and Nazi occupation, claims that she could have wheelbarrows of money and have not enough to pay even for a loaf of bread. This left so many German people suffering and homeless because they couldn't afford to live. The German economy was that awful. It was decimating, and the German people yearned to find a better nation, to find themselves again, because they were decimated from such a thing. And with any tragic occurrence, they looked for someone to blame. And with the rising person Adolf Hitler, he pointed the finger at the Jewish people. And the Germans agreed. They wanted someone to blame, and at the current time, most Jewish people were in charge of the banks and the money circulation at that time period. It was tragic, and because it was this, thus led to the beginning of the Holocaust. Once Germany had finally began to dig itself out of this hole that they had created, they decided that they had had enough and needed someone to blame. So thus began the gathering of the Jewish people. They were brought together and were slowly stripped of their rights. It wasn't immediate, because if they were immediately, then that would have raised alarms. But slowly and slowly, more and more, they began stripping them of their rights. Eli Wiesel, a Jewish Holocaust survivor, recalls the time of which his family was raided by German soldiers, of which they were forced to give up anything that the Germans found valuable in their homes, and were then forced to move to ghettos. Small, unhealthy parts of town, of which many other Jewish people were forced to live. After months of this process, finally the Jewish people were shipped off to camps, of which Livia Jackson recounts that she was loaded on with her mother and her brother and her father onto a cattle car with dozens of other different Jews and shipped off to camps. At this point, the Jewish people were less treated like people rather than animals. The status of the camps were no better. They were forced to be renamed rather than given names like Elizabeth or John. They were given numbers, and they were forced to abide by those. If not, they would be severely punished. It was decimating and depressing when they were finally alleviated in 1945 by Allied nations. They sought justice. I mean, any person would, with such a devastating point. But how do you go about providing But what was the effect of this? What happened after? That's what's really depressing. The effects of the Holocaust were decimating, and most Allied nations were distraught on how terrible and awful the status of the camps were and how these people were treated, how the Jewish people were treated. With the conclusion, and roughly given by historians, this one by Lewis Stone, is 5.4 to 5.8 million European Jews were executed during this time period. And the number is highly disputed among historians. Some challenge that the death count is close to 6 million. In order to attempt to provide justice to the people who had suffered, the Allied nations called upon what they called the Auschwitz trials, where they tried multiple different people of the German soldiers in an attempt to provide relief for Holocaust survivors. But according to historians like Lewis Stone, no more than 15% were provided justice. It is no doubt that the Holocaust had gained its name of the most tragic event in our history, taking the lives of almost 6 million Jews. But there is a very famous quote, and that is, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And that's what we try to accomplish here. No one wants this to happen again. It was decimating and tragic. But it's something no one could change. But we can learn.